Very good afternoon and welcome to this EPC briefing on COP26. I'm Annika Hedberg. I'm head of the Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program at EPC and will be moderating today's discussion with our excellent panel that includes Dr. John Murton, COP26 Envoy from the UK government, Jacob Werksman, Principal Advisor for International Aspects of EU Climate Policy from the Directorate-General for Climate Action, European Commission, and we hope that he will be joining us shortly from his previous meeting. And then we'll have Dr. Susanne Dröge, Senior Fellow at the German Institute for International Security Affairs. Very warm welcome and thank you for joining us. So now with COP26 behind us, we hear very different kind of evaluations that are emerging on what was achieved. Some see glass half full, others half empty. And undoubtedly, we also saw very different realities and dynamics play at the COP26. The life was very different in the negotiation rooms compared to the world outside. So where are we? If we look at COP26, what's the state of play in addressing the global climate crisis? In our discussion today, we'll reflect on the outcomes of COP26, the main achievements, biggest failures, as well as the way forward. And as always, we look forward also to the questions and comments from our audience. So if you are interested to ask questions, you can either click on the hand icon if you wish to speak, or alternatively, you can use space provided to ask short written questions. To get started, I would like to give the floor first to John Murton, who indeed is the COP26 Envoy from the UK government. So from the COP presidency perspective, what were the big things on the agenda? Where did we progress or not enough? And how happy are you yourself with the outcome? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Annika. So whether the glass is half full or half empty or somewhere in between, one thing that's clear is there's water in the glass, and that's the first thing. So we're happy about that. The glass wasn't broken. I don't know the audience, so I'm sort of not 100% confident about the level of climate knowledge and whether I'm going to speak at too basic a level or too detailed. So I'll try and pitch it somewhere in between. But one of the things that I think is always worth saying in panels like this is that Glasgow is not Paris. Despite what the media thinks, our job at Glasgow was not to negotiate a new climate change agreement. They tried to do that in Copenhagen and failed. They tried to do it in Paris and succeeded. Our job in Glasgow was not to negotiate a new agreement, but to show that the agreement that was reached in Paris could work. Because Paris was remarkable in its breadth and the fact it committed all 197 parties to action, but the methods by which it did so, this principle of nationally determined contributions and voluntary actions to achieve our ambitious climate targets is untested. And our job at Glasgow was to show that it could work. And one of the key things that we realized we had to do ahead of Glasgow was to inject much more of the real world into the negotiations than had been achieved at previous COPs. And that was important because if you go back as recently as Copenhagen, if you were asking countries to reduce their emissions, there was often this feeling that actually that came at the expense of their economic growth. And probably there was some of that at Paris as well. But we've seen huge technological change since Copenhagen. We've seen the cost of solar panels fall by 85%. We've seen the cost of batteries fall by 85%. We've seen a company called Tesla, which hadn't made a car back in Copenhagen, become the most valuable automotive firm in the world. And the cost of delivering climate action has fallen significantly. And increasingly now, it's not a trade-off between greening your economy and growing it, but actually you have to green your economy in order to grow it, because that's the fastest sector, the growing sector of the world economy. So we needed to inject real-world action. And what we wanted to do, therefore, at Glasgow was achieve ambition on 4 fronts. So in the very broadest sense of the word. One, we wanted ambition on mitigation, that's reducing emissions, and demonstrating that we could keep alive a pathway to limiting the rise in global temperatures to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade, right at the bottom end of the Paris Agreement between 2 and 1.5 degrees centigrade, because we know, and the science has become clearer in the years since Paris, that the difference on the natural world of the between 1.5 degrees C of warming and 2 degrees C of warming, and the difference on our cities, the difference on our livelihoods would be enormous. And so we spent the long time, the 2 years before Glasgow, traveling around the world virtually and in reality, encouraging countries to set ambitious NDCs and to set net zero targets and to put themselves on a trajectory that aligned with 1.5 degrees C. We also had ambition on finance because we know that for a lot of countries, especially those that aren't big emitters, they're very concerned to see other aspects of the Paris Agreement realized, namely the commitment that was made in Copenhagen and then again at Paris to deliver $100 billion of climate finance every year between 2020 and 2026. And that was a hugely important thing that we needed to deliver on. So we made ourselves very unpopular in capitals around Europe and in North America and in Asia, pushing donors to deliver on the $100 billion a year of climate finance, because we'd made that promise and it was hugely important to show that we could deliver on that if we were expecting countries around the world to make more ambitious steps on climate change. And we've come pretty close on that. We were also very much looking to be more ambitious on adaptation and highlighting adaptation as a theme throughout the 2 weeks of COP26, because even if we succeed in limiting the rising global temperatures to 1.5 degrees C, we know we've already got in the order of 1.1 degrees C of anthropogenic climate change in the system already. And many countries are already feeling the experience of that on a daily basis now. And you heard people like Prime Minister Motley speaking very powerfully about that at the COP. And we saw very powerful statements delivered literally from the sea by some presidents to just highlight the effect of climate change on their communities. And then we wanted to be ambitious in the sphere of international collaboration. We know that if we want to succeed in the multilateral system, we have to work together. And it was really important at Glasgow to finalize the outstanding elements of the Paris rulebook, to deliver on common timeframes, to deliver on Article 6, to deliver on transparency, and to cap it all with an ambitious overall statement that set clearly out the goals of the international community. And I think that there was a lot of progress there as well. And we also wanted to show that actually, even when we couldn't get 197 nations to agree on something in the formal negotiations, that we could actually make progress through plurilateral cooperation. And we had lots of theme days, as you saw through the COP, where we could show that these countries were gathering together to work on zero emission vehicles. These countries were gathering together to work on phasing out coal. These countries were gathering together to work on making sure that financial flows aligned with net zero. And that was really important because it gave encouragement that actually we could achieve things. You just look to the history of offshore wind. 4 countries in Northwest Europe essentially have commercialized offshore wind power for the rest of the world, and it's now being adopted in Vietnam and in China and in northeastern USA and so on. So we wanted to show those sectoral collaborations. And then if we look back on the fortnight, I think, it wasn't perfect, of course, but I think we've by and large achieved. We've seen the number crunchers come out and look at the impact of net zero commitments and NDCs, and we saw some fantastic net zero commitments from 2050 from Vietnam, a country of 110 million people on China's southern border, Kenya 2050. It wasn't just the advanced industrialized economies coming out with strong commitments. And the number crunchers tell us that actually, if people deliver on their 2030 commitments, then you're down to about 2.4 degrees C of warming. And if they follow through and deliver on their 2050 commitments, then the figures coming in at about 1.8, 1.9 degrees C of climate change is to be anticipated. Now, that's not 1.5, but at least it shows that actually we're bringing the anticipated level of climate change down if we can fulfill our commitments. If we look at what we did on finance, we've delivered with our German and Canadian colleagues the delivery plan for climate finance that shows we'll meet that 100 billion target a little bit late in 2023, possibly in 2022, but over the 5 years, 2021 to 2026, we'll deliver over $500 billion. And so in aggregate, we'll meet that total. We've delivered on adaptation. We've seen unprecedented pledges of finance towards adaptation, the biggest replenishment of the Adaptation Fund that we've ever seen, and commitments to increase the share of climate finance that will go to adaptation. And then, of course, on the rulebook, we've delivered. Article 6 has been concluded, the transparency details have been concluded, the work and common timeframes has been concluded, and we saw a really ambitious capping statement that, although it didn't include sort of the language on phasing out coal, it did register the notion that it needed to be phased down, and that was the first time that that's been picked up in that sort of statement, and it also highlighted the role of fossil fuel subsidies as well. So I think we achieved on a lot of our agenda. But one thing I would just sort of flag that's different this year is we've got a lot to do over the coming year. Our presidency doesn't end now. A lot of those plurilateral collaborations that I highlighted a minute ago, we've got to spend the rest of the year now fleshing out and making real. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this overview and showing what was actually achieved. And obviously we'll be happy to come back to a lot of these issues during the discussion itself. But moving on, Jacob Werksman, fantastic that you're able to join us, and you were able to catch up on some of the things that John Murton was describing. So indeed we got an overview of what were some of the goals as well as what was achieved at COP26. And from your perspective, representing DG Klima, European Commission, and obviously having been involved in these discussions for years, and obviously being heavily involved also at the COP26, how would you describe the hopes and expectations of the EU ahead of COP26 and where these actually met in the end?
Thanks, Annika, and I'm so sorry for coming in late, but I do think I caught most of the ambassador's comments and have a lot of the same appreciations of what we were able to achieve in Glasgow. I think that prior to Glasgow, the EU was very happy with the high benchmarks that the UK COP presidency had set, particularly with regard to ambition on NDCs and commitments to net zero and long-term strategies. I think we, honestly, together with many of the other donors, felt less comfortable with the high ambition that the UK government was setting with regard to the delivery of climate finance. Not because the EU hasn't been following through on what we consider to be our fair contribution to that $100 billion goal, but simply because it was being characterized as beyond symbolic, an issue of trust. And we felt that in delivering quite a bit of that climate finance on an annual basis, moving and closing the gap quite rapidly between 100 billion and where we were, that we in fact were behaving in a trustworthy manner. But having said that, we think in retrospect it was the right thing to do. And you saw that because we and other donors, in fact, were able to cough up more money as a result of that pressure and that spotlight that the UK COP presidency placed on us. And I think that was a good thing overall. Not because we felt that we hadn't been trustworthy in following through on those commitments, but because over time, I think all of us as conventional donors, but other donors as well, that aren't part of that existing pledge, have to realize that in order to achieve these targets, much more money has to flow. And so even if we'd met the $100 billion, we couldn't have been made to feel complacent about that. We've got to continue to find ways in which we can raise more resources from the public purse, but also more effectively leverage the private sector with that money, but also with additional policies such as setting benchmarks for what sustainable finance looks like when it flows from the private sector, in order to get the money flowing in the right direction. So we came in to Glasgow with similar expectations, particularly with regard to the delivering of mitigation commitments, and I think we came away from Glasgow feeling that a lot of effort was made and a lot was delivered. We are, I think, a little bit more reluctant to point to the kinds of numbers that we just heard referred to, and we see in some of the publications that show that the 1.5 being within reach. And the reason for that is that the assumptions that lie behind those numbers that show, for example, that after Glasgow, 1.8 degree global average temperature rise might be in reach, are based on all of those pledges being fulfilled, not just the 2030 targets, but the net zero commitments as well. And going through the experience that we're going through in the EU at the moment of having adopted binding legislation for our 2030 target and for the net zero pledge, and now trying to find the domestic policies that will get us there with confidence. We know this is a tremendous effort that's going to be required. And so again, just with 100 billion not being a source of complacency for the finance flows, those analyses of keeping 1.5 within reach cannot be a source of complacency for delivering on the emissions reductions. And I know that the ambassador feels the same way about it, but I just think we need to be cautious when those numbers are met. We haven't by any means solved this problem. Maybe just I'll make a few comments on what was agreed in Glasgow in terms of next steps. I think there's a lot in the cover decisions in the Glasgow Climate Pact that is going to be very helpful in terms of it being much more specific than Paris was in terms of our expectations of next steps. So the references to coal phase out, the fossil fuel subsidies phase out, those give much more direction, as do the references to non-greenhouse gas emissions, to methane. The references to 1.5 as being really now the new North Star for ambition. The references to long-term strategies, the need to get to net zero. This is much more specific than we were able to be in 2015 in terms of what we expect NDCs to reflect and country policies to reflect with regard to ambition. And those should be very helpful in guiding us into COP27 and COP28. However, the one thing that we weren't able to agree as part of that pact in terms of specificity is of whom do we expect those next steps? We weren't able, for example, to focus that call on the major emitters. And what that leaves us in terms of the political space is that many countries that have just enhanced their NDCs will say, well, we think we've done enough. We think that we are aligned with 1.5 or with net zero. So it must be someone else to whom that greater specificity in the pact refers to, and not to us. And we'll see how that plays out. But I think that was I couldn't say it's a missed opportunity because I think it would have been very difficult to achieve that in Glasgow. But it certainly is one of the big gaps and challenges ahead is trying to, in the way that we did in the run up to Glasgow, point the finger back at the major emitters that are responsible for so much of the problem and can deliver so much of the solution. One last comment I'd say is that the issue of loss and damage, which is at the other end of the spectrum of where international attention has been focused and where we have much less of an understanding of what we can do as an international community to help the communities, the countries around the world that are experiencing the impacts of climate change. That took an important step forward in Glasgow as well, in terms of identifying a significant challenge ahead for this regime. We know that we're not going to be able to solve the problems soon enough on the mitigation side of the equation. We've got to come up with better answers and better solutions as to how we help the communities that will be affected as a result of that. And I think it was a bit unfortunate that the dynamic emerged in Glasgow as a result of a demand that came from the G77 to establish in Glasgow a brand new facility for which we had no terms of reference or understanding in terms of what it would do and who would fund it. And that came, as I said, as a last minute demand, as being the test of whether or not we as the EU and other members of the international community are serious about this issue. We are serious about this issue. And in saying no to creation of a fund without any parameters around it, we weren't saying no to the seriousness with which we view this problem and with which we will commit ourselves to finding some kind of of solution that is up to that challenge. That conversation begins with this dialogue that we set up, but it's going to receive a lot of political attention in the year to come, and the years following COP27 as well. And we are committed to trying to find something that is an effective response, short of creating a new facility without any kind of mandate or sense of where it would get its resources. So I'll stop there. And again, apologies for joining the conversation late. I'm looking forward to it as it continues.
Thank you so much for this overview, and already touching upon some of the tension points and difficult issues, because I'm sure that these will be picked up also in the discussion. So that's very helpful. And I'll be happy to come back also on the next steps, because obviously the pressure needs to be increased as we move forward towards the next COP. And the question is indeed, and I think you rightly pointed on the fact that now it's not fully clear who should do what. And the big question is, how do we keep that pressure and make sure that the major emitters play their role? As our last speaker, we have Dr. Susanne Dröge. As I introduced you in the beginning, you're from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and we'll be very delighted to hear what your evaluation is on where we are and where we need to go now that the COP is over.
Yeah, thanks, Annika. And it's it's not much left to add when it comes to the many aspects of the COP and its outcomes. Still, I probably try to add some things that relate also to next year. I feel it was an interesting mix of positive and negative signals. I have a slight tendency to say we had some positive surprises given all the expectations that had to be managed, especially under the pandemic conditions and in the run-up. While, of course, the setting was very good, that the G7 process was led by the UK and G20 process was led by Italy, both being in charge for the COP presidency. And of course, all of us who are interested in the progress were lucky that the US elected a different president, right? So the scene setting was very different to what we had, for instance, in Madrid with the COP25. Then I felt it was very impressive that during week one we saw so many initiatives coming up. Well, initiatives are abound. It's not something I would put my bet on, but it was interesting still to see the sheer number of ideas, be it a just transition partnership with South Africa with very concrete ideas about how to phase out coal in South Africa with the support. So it could be a blueprint or example for more such initiatives, very basically addressing key problems of emission reductions and development cooperation, or also a more proactive approach for Brazil to solving the rulebook issues around Article 6, while some loopholes are left, especially for offsets. I think this is such a relief that the rulebook is done and over, and everything can now progress from this as a starting point. Because to explain to the audience, the rulebook is something the Paris Agreement cannot live without, and it was very much overdue, and kept it used a lot of energy to sort things out in Madrid. It didn't look nowhere that we get any result anytime soon. So this happened, and everybody who's interested in carbon markets is relieved that the rules are now set. There's not this gold standard idea behind it, but I think all parties are happy with it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen the result. And then, of course, big power play in the end. It's always the same kind of stage setting, and it was really unfortunate that there was an open stage power play by blocking language in the final communiqué, the statement, the Glasgow Climate Pact, which put this it emphasized the slightly negative perception that was brought up due to climate finance. That was not enough, but we had some progress on the climate finance, at least, given the pandemic situation worldwide. Or also the presidency had to cope with this different announcement it made towards countries that wanted changes, and then last minute, China, India,
Annika, can I just say one thing that is also important? We held a COP in person, and we had COVID rates that were less than a quarter of the prevailing rates in the community in Glasgow. So we proved it was possible to hold an in-person event in the age of COVID and do so without causing a super spreader event.
Thank you very much for this. And indeed, it's provides hope, I guess, for the other meetings that will be taking place also next year. It was known from the beginning that for this meeting, it was so important, it was considered so important, people will actually be able to be there in person to get progress going. So hopefully that indeed shows in some of the results. We have already some questions or question from the audience, but I would like to pick up on some things that you mentioned and then come to the developing world and questions around the developing world. But so now, first of all, we hear that obviously we need to see that the emission reduction commitments would be strengthened in 22. So can you give a bit more details, ideas on how do you think the pressure could be increased? What needs to happen to ensure that the emission reduction commitments really will be ambitious enough going to COP27? So is there a role? What will the EU do? What will the UK do? Susanne, if you have ideas, what is needed to be done, I would be very happy to hear your thoughts on that. And then I would be happy to hear your thoughts also on the US-China climate announcement. How important was this? What were the implications for the overall dynamic at the discussion? And then I would also like to get your kind of general sense on the importance of these different multilateral agreements, announcements, the initiatives that we heard on deforestation, methane, transport, energy, finance, etc. So how important were these announcements for the overall, again, the dynamic, showing the ambition and also their importance for the way forward? Who would like to go first? John?
I'll try. There's a lot of questions there. In terms of 2022 and countries coming back with more ambitious targets, well, there will be some countries who haven't submitted NDCs that have pledged to do so, and we'll be working hard through our presidency year to encourage all those that have. And actually, a lot of the sectoral work that we did at COP26, some of the agreements we fostered on things like zero emission vehicles or phasing out of coal or take up of renewable energy, a lot of that was designed to show countries that actually it's possible to be more ambitious than they thought was possible even just a few years ago. Germany looks like it's going to have a new government that's committed to net zero 2045. I really hope that within the EU, they don't just absorb that within the overall emissions reduction package, but actually use that as a chance to be more ambitious as a community through the EU, and don't just sort of soak that up as they look to achieve their own goals. I think the US-China announcement was important and helpful, but it came after the principal texts have been tabled. So I don't think it shaped the outcome perhaps in as strong a way as it might have done if it had come out before the principal text had been tabled. I think there was a lot of there's a lot of stuff that we'll have to follow through on in terms of some of the commitments that were made at COP26 and play out through the year. One of the sort of examples that I was most closely, two examples I was very closely associated with, the agreement that was reached between the international partner group, that's kind of the UK, the US, France, Germany, and the EU, with South Africa in terms of a just energy transition. And the $8.5 billion of finance that's been mobilized for that. At the moment, that's a political declaration. Over the coming year, we've got to turn that into a concrete investment plan that we can mobilize those resources against and deliver projects on the ground in South Africa so that they can see that there's actually progress towards a clean energy system that gives that country, which has got the most carbonized and the most energy and greenhouse gas intensive energy generation system in the world, the capacity not only to supply the power that the economy needs to grow, but also to do so in a way that reduces emissions. We've got to do that over the next year. At the COP26 conference, we got together 34 countries have signed a pledge to end all international public support for fossil fuels. So we actually have reached the same place with respect to all fossil fuels as we were with coal generation and international financing of coal just a few months ago, where actually you've got now all of the G7, apart from Japan, have committed to end fossil fuel financing overseas by the end of next year. That's a really impressive step, and some of the countries that signed that commitment did so at the conference, partly as a result of that, the magic you get at conferences of peer pressure and the capacity to sort of turn to one country and say, your neighbour signed this, are you going to sign it too? And we've got to work over the coming year to turn that into a reality in the same way as we've done in the UK back in March this year. Which takes me on to a question I can see in the chat from Nico Keppens about how can we give a clear reply to developing countries and how they can grow without the same energy resources to get to the living standards that citizens in developed countries have. I turn that around, Nico, and I'd say actually I've spent half my working life in Africa, most recently in DRC, one of the most energy poor countries in the world. And I can say with confidence and without a shred of hesitation that the only way you are going to get electric power to rural communities in DRC is through green mini grids and rooftop solar and other systems like that. You're not going to get it by building out a thermal powered energy grid with a national transmission structure. The economics just don't stack up. And we've seen this in other countries as well. Look at Kenya, where the M-KOPA rooftop solar program has put power into 500,000 households in rural communities over recent years at no cost to the taxpayer. And it does so in a way that gives communities and households access to power that's cheaper than the kerosene that they would burn to give themselves lighting. And that has huge impacts on things like girls' education and really positive indicators like that. So I would turn it around and say, actually, just like mobile telephones have given millions and millions of people access to telecommunications that they never had through fixed line telecoms, so renewable power will give millions and millions of people access to clean electrical power that they didn't have through thermal transmission systems. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll be happy to come back to that, because I think that this discussion that we're having in the developing world is very much the same discussion we could be having also in Europe, is actually to reduce our energy costs, etc. It's actually the clean energy transition to a great extent provides the solutions by investing in renewables, by enhancing energy efficiency. It actually can help to address many of the challenges that there are and exist because of the current energy fossil fuel-based system. So clearly much more discussion is needed on how to actually upscale and ensure that these solutions are being deployed, not only in Europe, but obviously in the developing world. And happy to come back to you also on that. How can we actually help the developing world to benefit from these solutions that are already there and actually are becoming increasingly affordable? But Jake, handing over to you, a number of issues to be addressed.
Yeah, well, I think I touched on some of this in my initial comments, but I mean, you can imagine that there are kind of three pieces of the Paris machinery. One is what we've been running to try to raise the level of NDCs, so to get pledges and targets bumped up, and that political process, years of bilateral and multilateral diplomacy from Paris up to Glasgow yielded that increase of ambition in the form of stated targets and pledges. And there's part of what what we agreed in Glasgow that will keep that running, but on an annual basis. So we now have a work program with these new benchmarks of what ambition looked like to sort of guide that conversation. What's different from previously is that Glasgow actually creates for the first time a multilateral space to talk about mitigation ambition. There was no agenda item on mitigation prior to that work program that was established as part of the Glasgow pledge. So that might change the dynamic as well in terms of multilateralizing the conversation about ambition, but still focused on ambition being measured in terms of what a country pledges to do through its NDC or its long-term strategy. The second machinery that operates in Paris is the transparency and accountability mechanism, which focuses on, are you actually implementing your pledge? And having that set of rules that Susanne mentioned on the transparency framework will help, I think, to start that conversation as well. I actually have a lot more confidence that that's going to yield more ambition than the first part of the machinery, because I think we at least in the coming years have kind of squeezed that rock dry for most of the major emitters. They've just gone through this process of raising their NDC. Asking them to do it again in Sharm el-Sheikh is important, but I have more confidence that we're going to get more implementation and therefore more ambition going through the second part of the machinery, which kind of reveals all those opportunities that the questioner identified and that John just pointed to now in terms of the benefits of taking action. The third machinery is not so much part of the formal process, but it's all of these sectoral related pledges, these partnerships that run from largely bilaterally focused, as the South African partnership is, all the way up to the global methane pledge, where we're hoping to get countries to kind of think outside the box of their NDCs and to look at opportunities they might not have thought about in the context of designing their own domestic policy. Could they include methane in a way that they hadn't before? Could they achieve an accelerated pace of ambition with some support to a just transition? And I think that there's a lot of reason to be optimistic in that part. But those two other pieces of the machinery require us to obsess a little bit less about how it is that NDCs represent whether we're being ambitious, and kind of look underneath them to what countries are actually doing in practice.
Thank you. And Susanne, would you like to add?
Sure, I probably could add that I think this is what Jake has described is definitely the logic of the COPs and the ongoing UN processes. And I think the support needs to come from outside the UNFCCC processes. Basically, there is, of course, a lot of civil society pressure, and this has been part of COPs since they exist. But I think also it needs to be understood that this is, in a way, in a decisive phase, because there's a lot of impatience mounting up, and I think this needs to be addressed somehow also in every country, in every engagement member to this process. I see also that thinking outside of the box, as Jake has said, means that several issues need to be more mainstreamed, even more as we have it now, well, we have just a new German coalition treaty where we have a certain degree of mainstreaming of climate issues across departments. We have the Green Deal, which does exactly this thing. So I think it is important to look at who's talking to whom, in which circles do you discuss the next steps, specifically sectoral things. And that brings me to the third point. Of course, what is key for the next steps in implementing climate policy? It's financial. I mean, it's about taxonomies and investment agendas, about transparent investment, information, what is sustainable, what is not. It's a process that's just started, but it needs to be connected to the COP process. And so the bilateral or plurilateral talks need to address this. It's about trade policy that needs to support, which is difficult given the situation of the WTO, but maybe also again you could start or bring it to the plurilateral forums that are in favor of the COP process, and the connect between these parallel forums is really super important. And it has existed, it has been used and existing, but I think especially next year this is needed for the action that has been mentioned by the two other speakers. Otherwise, we will end up with a need for more initiatives, and we have a pile of initiatives that never materialized in substance. And I think this is a big difference for next year and the coming years, to make sense out of the Glasgow initiatives and also to follow up on them, not only to what Jake said, the second way of addressing and making transparent where countries stand, but also, in where do these initiatives that are not part of the core process stand, and is there responsibility that is being also taken over? I fully trust that UK is totally committed, but this has to be carried over to the other presidencies.
Thank you very much. I mentioned that I would like to come back. We already touched upon the developing world, but I think it would be good to come back to that, because indeed we did see quite a bit of tension between the developed and developing world during the COP26. So just first of all, do you think that there is a trust gap that is widening between the developed and developing countries? And then on these commitments, so we saw that indeed developed countries agreed that they should at least double their provision of climate finance for adaptation. So does this mean that we would expect to see more focus on adaptation in the future, for example, in the COP27? And then also picking up on the question that was posed by Chiara Scottrani, that while we see a big focus on green energy and eliminating fossil fuels, at the same time, even if we do change our energy sources, that will mean that we will continue to consume, exploit our natural environment. I'll build up on this question, just say that obviously, for example, if we look at renewable energies, they require a lot of resources, and a lot of these resources do come from the developing world. So how is this challenge being considered, and how are the developed countries planning to address this issue? Also, I see that we have a different question coming from Thomas Arnold related to agriculture, and what are your views on the climate benefits of reducing intensive livestock and consumption of animal products, especially in developed countries? And to what extent, I'll build up on this, to what extent was agriculture being discussed, and the role for our food systems, to what extent was that being discussed at the COP26? Who would like to go first? Start again with John.
Might change a habit. So on the finance, I heard Jake earlier say that he was uncomfortable in a way that we'd pushed the Europeans, we pushed the Americans, we pushed the Canadians, we pushed the Japanese, and anyone who would listen in the donor community hard on climate finance. And I'm really glad we did, and I'm really glad we made people uncomfortable, because if we hadn't have made people uncomfortable, we wouldn't have made the progress that we did and got to the stage where we can demonstrate if we fulfill our stated public commitments, we'll deliver on that 500 billion over the 5 years. And what we heard as presidency was that that was a matter of trust, and that countries very clearly felt that it, before we asked them to do anything more on mitigation and so on, we needed to deliver on that climate finance. And whether, that was what people were saying, and we had to take it at their word. And I am convinced that if we hadn't have made the progress we did do on climate finance, we wouldn't have succeeded in delivering as much ambition at Glasgow in the other areas otherwise, because we wouldn't have held that consensus together going into the final phase. So I think it was right. There will be more focus on adaptation finance in the future. And one of the reasons for that is increasingly, as we see more and more investment in the low carbon economy, it's increasingly, you don't need public finance to crowd private finance into the mitigation space. You don't need private finance to set up a solar farm or a wind farm in most economies of the world. If you look at what Bloomberg Energy are saying, they're saying virtually the entirety of net capacity additions to the global energy grid over the last couple of years have been in renewable energy, because that's the cheapest form of energy now. So the private market is pushing money into that area, and so that creates more scope to invest more in adaptation, which is much harder to crowd finance into, but is equally important. I would sort of look at Chiara's question and I say, well, we have to be really careful in Northwest Europe. The Greta Thunberg narrative doesn't play well in many markets around the world. As I mentioned earlier, my last tour overseas was in the DRC, and we have to be really careful how we talk about climate in a country like DRC. We have enjoyed mobility. We have enjoyed houses that keep us at the right temperature. We have enjoyed being able to have telecommunications and light in our house after it gets dark. And we have to, as a global community, be very careful in sort of, people were very alert to any sense that we might be suggesting that we have these things and now you can't have them. Because that will not motivate people to action. So if we're to get political buy-in to what we want to do, which is to reduce emissions, we need to find a way in which we can say to people, actually, you can have a protein-rich diet, and you can have lighting in your house after it gets dark, and you can heat or cool your house so it's the right temperature, and you can have mobility so you can get around and you can see your friends and you can see your family like we enjoy in the West. But we can do it in a way that doesn't have that negative impact on the environment. And if we don't make that option available to them, people will say, well, we'll burn fossil fuels to heat or cool our homes, and we'll burn fossil fuels to have mobility because we want what you have. And I don't think there's much of a market in any of our economies for a sort of a set of climate solutions that don't enable people to maintain those things. So we have to work in that direction, and I think that's a really important part of fostering the consensus in the negotiations at the UNFCCC. And Thomas's question about agriculture, I would just encourage you to go away and read some of the stuff about precision fermentation that's out there. I mean, regularly, my daughter's a vegetarian. We regularly eat a lot of the new products that are out there on the market that look like meat and taste like meat, and have many of the protein benefits of meat, but don't involve sort of such intensive farming processes and have less impact on issues like methane on the environment. So I think that's all coming, but we need to give these opportunities to people to have the protein-rich diets that we enjoy. So we need to find a way that enables them to do that without the impact upon the planet.
Thank you. Jake, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the general point that John was making about equity and making sure that when we're making arguments about a global effort, we take into account the still remaining profound differences between the way in which people access energy and are able to use energy around the world is a really important one. And one of the reasons why that final debate in plenary didn't actually upset me in the same way it upset others. I think what India and China were saying is, of course, we realize that coal can't be part of a net zero future, but don't ask us to make the same kind of commitment in terms of a phase out that is more comfortable for countries to make if they've already begun that process a long time ago and don't have that same dependency. So I didn't see it as a rejection of the need to get rid of coal, but rather an indication that the pace in which it's phased out has to be understood from a perspective of equity. Maybe agriculture is discussed. It's discussed at every COP. There's a dedicated space to talk about it, something called the Coronivia platform, that does take up the issue of methane and carbon-intensive agricultural practices. But the whole idea around making commitments at the global level with regard to what people see as lifestyle choices and diet, I think is still some time away. It was a big step forward to be able to focus in on things like fossil fuel subsidy reform, but reforming of diets, I think, is still a challenge for the future. Having said that, the global methane pledge that John referred to before is one of the significant outcomes from Glasgow does cover methane from agricultural emissions, and for those countries that joined it that have significant emissions from livestock, they will now be under more pressure to figure out ways of getting those emissions under control. So that's a good thing. On consumption-based emissions, it's a very important point to make, and one that we're struggling with in the EU. You know, having gone through a process where our economy has grown but decarbonized at the same time, we recognize that some of that, not as much as others may think, but some of that was achieved by importing energy-intensive goods from overseas, and therefore seeing emissions rise elsewhere while we maintain the same consumption patterns within the EU. We are now trying to deal with that challenge more directly through measures such as the carbon border adjustment measure that's part of the Commission's Fit for 55 proposal, as a way of making sure that as we cut our emissions, we're not causing emissions to rise elsewhere through carbon leakage. That proposal isn't particularly popular with our trading partners who want us both to cut emissions domestically, as well as not contribute to climate change internationally, but to not do it through managing the carbon footprint of our own economy. So it does place those of us who are kind of a bit ahead of the game in terms of decarbonizing our economy in a very challenging situation. But you know, we are committed to driving the development of new technologies and greater innovation in such a way that allows us to decarbonize without deindustrializing and creating more of a circular economy in which we are responsible for all of the emissions that our consumers produce. But that does require putting in place measures like the CBAM, at least at this stage in the development of the global economy, where there are many countries still that want to sell their products into the EU, but that haven't taken particularly ambitious steps to get their emissions under control.
Thank you. And there's so many other issues that I would be happy to pick up on, for example, CBAM, and knowing what kind of reactions there were to CBAM. But if we have time, I'll be happy to come back to that. But Susanne, would you have anything else you would like to add?
Maybe yes. I mean, what we are faced with is that definitely the climate talks have become the battleground for a number of inequalities that exist around the world that are in combination with climate change now really at the center of the discussion. And sorry, but the climate policy cannot solve everything here. And that is sometimes really just not fair to burden the process with all this. And that is what I said before. There are other processes around outside the UN that need to deliver also on this end. And so I think this is also the task of the G formats, which are by now, even though they are not that legitimate as the UN, are now the places where heads of states are meeting on a regular basis and can be confronted over again with what they do also internally. Because in a digitalized world, we are not talking with a lot of information. We're not talking about rich countries and poor countries. There are poor people in both countries and rich people in both countries. So I think this is truly also another redistribution issue that has to be resolved by nations themselves. They cannot just outsource and place it on the table of UN talks over again without delivery. And I think this is really something to be, I mean, this is what I just want to give a warning here, that the process sometimes is totally overburdened with other highly political, geopolitical things. One thing that is of interest is that how the G77 is in motion, how this functions in the climate context, and how China and also India and probably other emerging economies are more more and more at the center of attention. So it's not only that the developing countries ask the EU and other historical emitters, rightly so, to do more, but it's also that really there is a big disappointment about Chinese engagement also in poorer countries, which China, of course, we all know that with Belt and Road and all these ideas about how to shape the global world order is trying to connect to, while at the same time not delivering on such substantial matters like climate protection. And so there is a lot of dynamic ongoing where there is leverage also politically for the EU and other industrial countries. We cannot solve all the problems, and I think the CBAM example shows that very well. If the EU wants to do more and wants to be credible and it does something about its consumption, immediately these issues are being raised, that again is super unfair. Yeah, be careful what you ask for. I think this will dominate the debate for the next years and will pop up at different points. I expect this to pop up again with Article 6 implementation if countries decide to engage in emissions trading, if companies and countries decide to buy offsets, why this is not the best way to achieve climate protection. That will continue again in similar settings. So I think we are in tricky times. I do not have the answer, just want to say that, that it is a really very complex process, not only because it's a long list of topics.
I'm very much aware that we're running out of time, so I'll pose one more question to all of you. Your priority, what do you want to see happening in the next, let's say, 3 months to keep up the work, to keep up the ambition, and to increase the ambition? And also picking up on who are the laggards, who do we need to really focus on at the moment? Where do we need to put our attention? And obviously it could be different for the EU than it is for the UK as a presidency, but happy to hear your final thoughts on that, and then we wrap up. Susanne, if that's okay, I could start with you first and we'll go in the reverse order.
Sure. I think to add a specific issue, because I'm talking here from Berlin, is that I hope that within the next 3 months, the new German government will become one of the key drivers of the processes just mentioned. If there is the idea to use the G7 to follow up on particular issues, then I very much hope it is closely linked to what we have witnessed at the COP, and not a reinvention of the wheel when it comes to initiatives how to implement together with other allies specific climate protection issues. I think we have more than enough topics on the table to serve this purpose. So my wish would be that there would be a strong engagement from Germany and also, of course, from France as a president of the EU.
Thank you very much. Jake?
Well, I would agree with that, but even more so say I think it's more in the hands of the G20 than it is with the G7 at the moment, particularly if you're focused primarily on raising the level of ambition through NDCs and long-term strategies. What China does next is going to determine more about where that needle is, whether it's 1.8, 1.9, et cetera, than just about anything else. But I would want to see, as my previous remarks indicated, a real pivot to focus on implementation. I think that is where ambition is going to be realized and optimalized, and focusing constantly on getting a government just to state a higher and higher target doesn't make sense to me, particularly at this stage in the politics. Thanks.
Thank you. And John?
I don't disagree with anything that's gone forward. Implementation is going to be key now, and demonstrating that actually we can deliver on our commitments and surprise ourselves at how much cheaper and swifter we can meet the commitments than we thought we could is something we've done in the UK historically with wind and solar rolling out. We've done it far quicker and cheaper than we thought we would, and we need to demonstrate that we can continue to do that in each of our own countries. Germany is going to be an exciting driver with the new government and the new targets it's taken on, and hopefully that will set the pace in the G7, and we look forward to passing the G7 baton to our German friends. And Indonesia, I think, can play a powerful role in the G20. Indonesia was very constructive at COP26. We had a very constructive dialogue with them on forest and commodities trade and support. You look at the progress they've made in just the last decade on tackling deforestation. And President Jokowi has been clear that he's ready to wean Indonesia off coal by 2040 if the assistance is available to Indonesia to do that. So there's a challenge for everyone around the table.
Thank you so much. I feel that we were only able to touch the surface and there would have been so many other issues I would have been happy to pick up on. Unfortunately, we weren't able to come back to the question that was posed from the audience on migration. That would have been one of the things. Another one is the role for nature-based solutions. And we saw that, for example, in the Glasgow Climate Pact, it proposed annual dialogue to strengthen ocean-based action. And I would have been happy to hear your thoughts on that. But just to say, at EPC, we continue the discussion only next week on Thursday, 2nd of December at 10, we'll be having a discussion on the role of oceans, not only as a victim, but also a solution to the climate and wider ecological crisis. So anyone who's interested to continue this discussion, and especially the discussion on the role of nature-based solutions. So this is something we'll be looking at already next week. And just want to say big thank you for our panel for sharing your insights, your knowledge, your expertise, and I would say giving us hope that we are moving forward. And obviously a lot needs to be done, but it is great that we are seeing and that there is ambition and obviously a lot of good ideas there. And now, as was so much stressed here, it does come down to implementation. And obviously that's where we will be judged also by our future generations. So it is essential that we do see that action happening. So thank you so much for our audience, for joining, and look forward to following the progress.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Bye.